Okay. And let's see. Okay, and we are live. So, hello everyone, and welcome to Nerd Church, the place where I get to prove that I am a true member of Gen X by imitating my heroes, my teenage heroes, Wayne and Garth, and having my own public access cable show. I am joined in this endeavor by Aldo because when you're reading the Bible, it's always useful to have someone who can read at least some of the original languages. And Amanda, because when a couple of Catholics get together to talk about the Bible, it's always a good idea to have someone to say, "Wait, what?" And also because Amanda is a person who, when I get the idea at 2 in the afternoon that, we really should have a pretty banner for our channel, she throws one up right away, which is why we were a little bit late getting started today. Occasionally, so what do we do? So that's who we are. Why are we here? We are here to read through the Bible and as Christians learn to not read the Bible like a bunch of idiots. To help us do that, we read the scholarship of critical scholars of all faiths and no faiths as they read the Bible in a way that takes into account the history of the text and of the time that the texts were written in, because they are not hostile to religion, but they are extremely hostile to ignorance and stupidity. We also do this because we want to give people who are locked into sola scriptura a better way to read the Bible, and also to show interested scholars and interested non-Christians what it looks like when Christians read the Bible in a honest and sincere way that tries to allow them to live in the world as better people. And now that I am done talking everyone's ear off, which is the other theme of the show, can get started. Today, we are unfortunately not joined by the great Kip Davis, who is the Alice Cooper of my tortured Wayne's World analogy. But occasionally we will have Dr. Davis and hopefully other scholars dropping by from time to time to help us out and just generally class up the joint. So without further ado, we will get started. I will go into screen sharing, bring up the texts. Amanda and Aldo will read them, and then we will talk about them. Okay. Okay, and we are starting out. This is the third Sunday in Ordinary Time, and we are continuing our fast forward sort of clip reel of Jesus's ministry. And we're also spending a little bit more time with Isaiah. If you've been with Nerd Church from the beginning or go back and check out our previous episodes, you may notice that this is the second time that we have heard from some of these verses of Isaiah. So, Aldo, if you want to get started.
Sure.
This is, I don't know if you can read on the screen. This is Isaiah 8, verse 23 through verse through chapter 9, verse 3.
Correct. First, the Lord degraded the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. But in the end, he has glorified the seaward road, the land west of the Jordan, the district of the Gentiles. Anguish has taken wing, dispelled is darkness. For there is no gloom where, but now there was distress. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Upon those who dwelt in the land of gloom, a light has shone. You have brought them abundant joy and great rejoicing. As they rejoice before you as at the harvest, as people make merry when dividing spoils, for the yoke that burdened them, the pole on their shoulder, and the rod of their taskmaster, you have smashed as on the day of Midian.
Okay, and I'll scroll down so you can get the psalm.
Thank you. And this is Psalm 27, verses 1, 4, and 13 through 14. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom should I fear? The Lord is my life's refuge. Of whom should I be afraid? One thing I ask of the Lord, this I seek, to dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, that I may gaze on the loveliness of the Lord and contemplate his temple. I believe that I shall see the bounty of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait for the Lord with courage. Be stout-hearted and wait for the Lord.
Okay. And now we have the second reading where we have Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 1, verse 10 through 13, and then also verse 17.
You want me to read?
Yeah, please.
Okay. I urge you, brothers and sisters, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you agree in what you say, and that there be no divisions among you, but that you be united in the same mind and in the same purpose. For it has been reported to me about you, my brothers and sisters, by Chloe's people, that there are rivalries among you. I mean that each of you is saying, I belong to Paul, or I belong to Apollos, or I belong to Cephas, or I belong to Christ. Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Are you baptized in the name of Paul? For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, and not with the wisdom of human eloquence, so that the cross of Christ might not be emptied of its meaning.
Okay, and then we have our gospel.
Me again?
Yep, you again.
All right. When Jesus heard that John had been arrested, he withdrew to Galilee. He left Nazareth and went to live in Capernaum by the sea, in the region of Zebulun and Naphtali, that what had been said through Isaiah the prophet might be fulfilled. Land of Zebulun and land of Naphtali, the way to the sea, beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people who sit in darkness have seen a great light, and on those dwelling in a land overshadowed by death has arisen. From that time on, Jesus began to preach and say, Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. As he was walking by the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, who was called Peter, and his brother Andrew, casting a net into the sea. They were fishermen. He said to them, Come after me, and I will make you fishers of men. At once they left their nets and followed him. He walked along from there and saw two other brothers, James, the son of Zebedee, and his brother John. They were in a boat with their father Zebedee, mending their nets. He called them, and immediately they left their boat and their father and followed him. He went through all of Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom, and curing every disease and illness among the people.
Okay. So that's everything that we had. So that's our readings from the lectionary. So I'm going to stop sharing for a second. And I think that the only thing that I want to highlight from this, excuse the trash from the lunch, is that we've got this passage from Isaiah that obviously that was, if you recall, read at Christmas, and then it's quoted again in the Old Testament reading, and then it's showing up again as it's showing up again actually being quoted by the author of Matthew in the gospel, right? So it's kind of I think that it's worth really kind of taking a look at what the compilers of the lectionary are trying to do with this, right? Because this is obviously a piece of Isaiah that's really important. I think primarily because it's talking about kind of what does the messianic kingdom look like, and really hammering down the idea that this is meant to be understood as kind of a global conversion and like a global mission, right? That we're not talking about God being the God of this one tribe, but the God of the world, the God of the universe. And also, I think in a way, because we have the author of Matthew saying, okay, Jesus did this to fulfill the prophecy in Isaiah. Again, it's part of the project of making the case that Jesus is the Messiah. And it's also sort of, in a way, modeling the way that Christians are going to be engaging with the Old Testament, pretty much for the rest of history, right? Where the Old Testament is basically treated as something, for good and bad, honestly, is basically treated as almost something to quote mine, or to, okay, well, this part of the New Testament doesn't quite make sense, so we're going to go back into the Old Testament and try to make sense of it. And also, showing how, even in the lectionary, it's like, okay, we're looking for the pieces of Isaiah that match with the gospel, or we're looking for the passages of whatever book of the Old Testament or whatever psalm fits in with the gospel theme, and basically demonstrating that we're in the same, that doing that is effectively acting in the same tradition that the authors of the gospel did. So in a way, it's very cleverly kind of legitimating the entire idea of the way that Catholics read the Bible and showing that that's scriptural. So it's kind of a lot. And then plus, of course, it's also, kind of calling back to Christmas. So if you went to church at Christmas, you're like, oh yeah, I remember that part. And then also it's kind of between Christmas and Easter, if you are going to Mass every week or almost every week, you're basically getting this summary of the life, of the birth, life, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus, basically crammed in between Christmas and Easter. So between the end of December and the beginning of April, which is kind of cool if you think about it, like as an editorial project. So I've talked too much. That's all I wanted to say. Does anybody else want to chime in before we start breaking them down piece by piece?
Not really.
Okay. I know, Aldo, you had quite a bit to say when we talked about this piece of Isaiah the first time. So do you want to kind of just go over that again, maybe?
Sure, no problem. So basically, this belongs to what scholars call First Isaiah. Now, most of us would think that each and every book in the Bible was written from beginning to end by the author or the purported author, the person who bears the name of the book. But that isn't actually the case. What scholars do is they analyze the kind of themes, the kind of language, even at least in the Hebrew text. They will check on the way words are spelled, and then that way they will determine the age and the provenance of a possible provenance of the text. So by using all these elements, what they have found is that the book of Isaiah was written by 3 different authors. The first one they, of course, call First Isaiah, and this runs from chapters 1 to 39. And this is most likely, if we were to assign this part of the book to Isaiah, chapters 1 to 39 would most probably be the ones which were written by Isaiah or by people from his circle around the time he lived. Then comes chapters 40 and to 55, and these are they were written during the Babylonian exile. That is the 6th century, which is already two centuries after the first Isaiah. And then the last part is Trito Isaiah, the 3rd Isaiah, chapters 56 to 66, and this is a post-exilic text. So it comes from when the Jews returned from Babylon, and that is the late.
So that's a really big gap, like both in time and also just what's going on culturally.
Correct. So we're talking about around 250 years of different hands penning Isaiah from the beginning to the end. And of course, ideas evolve and ideas change along the book, and those are the ones which tell scholars that this book wasn't written by just one person. Now, regarding the reading, so we're talking about a time where perhaps Isaiah or people close to him wrote this section of the book. And what they're referring with the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, they were oppressed by the Assyrians. So that is why this part of the text is trying to tell us that King Hezekiah is the one who is mentioned here, and they are trying to remember this time when these 2 tribes were enslaved or became vassal states for the Assyrians. And there's some interesting symbolism going on in here. So whenever they talk about darkness is the political oppression, and light, on the other hand, is this freedom they get from the Assyrians. And also the image of the yoke that burdened them is again this powerful empire or this powerful kingdom who is burdening them with taxes and some kind of military oppression. So when it says that that this has already ended, it is because King Hezekiah has successfully become king of Judah, and in a way, the northern kingdom of Israel has already benefited from that as well. Now, it's interesting to note that we will have three different views from this section. So the one I just gave you was the historical setting, the most likely real historical setting of the book of Isaiah. Sorry, Katie?
Yeah, no, and I was just I was just saying,
Oh, okay.
no,
Sorry, I thought you.
I was just saying, so you knew I was paying attention.
Okay, perfect. And then if we go to the, for example, to the Targums, which I use regularly, these late Aramaic translations and interpretations of the Hebrew scriptures, they reinterpret this passage as all these negative circumstances and events which happened to the kingdom of Judah were because of the people not following the Torah, forgetting about all the promises and all the miracles that God did for them when they left Egypt during the Exodus. And then we have this third interpretation in the Gospel of Matthew, where the light, which is mentioned here, is actually associated with Jesus. So it's interesting how just one text is interpreted by different cultures and in different times, in different ways, just to suit the needs of each community.
Yeah. And of course, that is, a reason why these texts have survived and are still being read, is because although they were written very specifically for a very specific time and place, because they were written in this kind of generalized coded language, they're saying things about empire and about the experience of being oppressed and living under an oppressive empire that can kind of apply to anyone who's living in those circumstances. So they keep getting borrowed and reinterpreted and used by people who still need that kind of language. And I think that that's a really important, and to me, that's, sort of something that lets me sort of go, okay, this is why this is still relevant to my life.
Exactly. So I think that it's, of course, if we, even if we would depart from the actual historical meaning, that doesn't mean we should not, interpret the text in a way where it becomes useful in our lives.
Yeah. And I think that as long as we're aware of the fact that this isn't a text that was written for us in our time, but and we understand and respect what it meant in context, we can also say, okay, this is what it means for us, and use it. And I, like to think that, the author of Isaiah would be happy that their words are still being used to help people get strength and courage as they are dealing with oppression, thousands of years later, although he would probably also be really upset to find out that, that oppressive empires are still a problem. And finding out that the Messianic age is still not quite here yet.
Correct.
I
I
think
agree.
I think the struggle with that's the hardest with these is that yes, we do reinterpret it for ourselves and make it useful. But the the remembering that somebody else has different readings of that, and that's okay, can
Yeah.
be difficult. Because I mean, a lot of these sections of Isaiah are read in lots of churches as solely about the prophecy of the prophesying of Christ, and not being used to discuss Christ. I mean, because that's what Paul does. I
Yeah.
know. I'm sorry, I ran with Paul. Am I on an episode if I don't?
Yeah,
Um, but that's what Paul does when he quotes a scripture. He's not ignoring, because he knows where it's coming from, that he's studied that, but he's using it as a way to discuss Christ and like to validate that essentially. But it's not erasing, and I think lots of modern people can't do that.
yeah. And I think that it also makes a difference that we tend to think of like texts as like these things that are very rigid and very fixed, and what's printed is all that there is, and somehow you're not supposed to change it and mess with it and negotiate it with it. Whereas, and I think that this is something that you really appreciate when, and I haven't read, I've read a little tiny bit of the Talmud in translation. And one of the things that I find most appealing about it is that it's an argument. It's this giant argument about again across time that rabbis are still participating in, right? So there's this sense, so there's this sort of beautiful sense that like these texts aren't dead, and in a very real sense the people who wrote these texts aren't dead, because they're still talking to us and we're still talking to them and we're still having this argument.
Mhm.
And I think if you view it as a conversation, it becomes, a lot more important than just looking at the Bible as, it's this big brick of text that dropped down from heaven in 1611 when King James got everybody together to translate the Bible into English, which, as we all know, is God's own language. um,
Paul wrote in English. Come on. Um,
although is trying to be very polite and not.
Well, you talk about the King James Version, but a running joke over here in Latin America is that, so for example, we have all these old movies from the 20th century, black and white movies,
Yeah.
and then they are in Spanish, and of course, Jesus speaks like a peninsular Spaniard. He
Uh-huh.
doesn't speak Mexican Spanish, of course, because he was a European Christ,
Yeah.
and he was blonde and blue-eyed. And I
Yeah.
think once got it coming from a kid from from a very rural area in Mexico. And
Yeah.
I have a friend who is blonde and he has blue eyes.
Yeah.
He's
Yeah.
actually from Spanish descent.
Yeah.
And the kid saw him and he said, with some kind of fascination, he said, he has the eyes of a saint. Because,
Yeah.
all the church statues have the same physical characteristics, blonde hair, clear eyes, blue, gray,
Yeah.
green, whatever. And so
Yeah.
this kid actually looking at a person for the
Yeah.
first time in his life who was actually a physical embodiment of those statues was a
Wow.
surprise to him. So, and I'm talking about this some 25 years ago.
Yeah.
Huh.
Wow. That's wild.
Yeah.
But yeah, so but my point is that I think that when you look at the Bible as like it's this thing, boom.
Mhm.
You know, Isaiah is just one book and all of it was written by Isaiah. It's easy to kind of just it's a thing that I can, you know, pull quotes from as I need it, right? Whereas if you're looking at it as kind of this ongoing conversation, it's more like I have this question. I'm going to go see what Isaiah had to say about it. Or I'm going to see what, you know, these other people who were kind of working in a very specific place and time had to say about this. And then see if what they're saying makes any sense and applies to me. And I think if you approach it with that kind of honesty and looking at it as a conversation, it's a lot healthier than trying to, you know, insist that, you know, Moses wrote the parts of the Bible that talk about Moses dying. um, which, you know, just I don't think does anybody any good.
I I think it might be interesting to consider that. Sorry, we're having an ice storm, and I think it's
Oh
just
yeah,
trees just crackling out the window.
yeah, I would, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah, that's what it is. I just was making sure. Sorry, I didn't mean to blank out on you like that.
For
But
people who are watching this video, I just want to say briefly for people who are watching this video like now, um, most of the northeastern US is like getting a massive amount of snow and ice, and please stay safe and stay warm. If you're watching this from the future, we hope that everything was okay. Um, and yeah, in Arizona, there was a little tiny bit of frost on the ground this morning.
ooh,
Yeah, I know. I had to wear closed-toed shoes. It was shocking. But you know, truly, my heart goes out to you, and and Amanda will get her chance to gloat in August when it's 120 degrees freedom.
uh, it's not that much cooler here, and it's muggy. It's
Yeah.
awful
Okay.
here.
So but anyway, moving along. Okay, so you had your ice storm.
So we're having our ice storm, and it's not that bad where I live because I live in the southeast and I live in a little pit where the weather is not as bad. So yay. But it did make an alarming sound outside for some reason. The trees out there. Um, but I think part of it subconsciously is we are used to a modern printing situation, and we're used to the Bible as a whole. And so it's not even that we have a hard time conceptualizing that Isaiah as multiple like texts kind of collated together, is we struggle with that sometimes as like the entire thing collated together. Like we know, but like we don't really think of it that way.
Yeah.
So that I think causes us, it is a blind spot for us modern folk.
Mhm.
That's correct. I think Amanda made a great point because we take it for granted that we have a Bible, but uh, in reality, well, you have to make things even more complex. We have ancient translations which attest to different readings in the Bible. We have we have variants among those translations. So perhaps you have the Greek translation at variance with 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 the Hebrew text, and the Hebrew text had its own variants, as well as the Greek translation, the Syriac translation, the Latin translation, and there's even a very strange phenomenon, which I think I have already mentioned in passing in some other video, where some perhaps patristic sources, the so-called church fathers, or even the rabbis, they cite yet some other kind of variants in the texts, and they even cite whole verses which are no longer extant in our text of the Bible. So it's really difficult for you to just to say the Bible says such and such, because you would have to refer to specific translation, to specific time period, to a specific geographic location. So yeah, it's not that easy to pinpoint or to nail down the exact meaning of the Bible.
Yes, exactly. And and again, just the existence of printing as opposed to handwriting does a lot to standardize the text, because if you can print an almost infinite number of identical books, that's way different than having to have a person sit down and hand copy the entire thing. And if when and if Dr. Davis appears, I would like to really give him a chance to talk about kind of just the mechanics of scribal practices, and how people talk and how scholars are able to tell, like, if something is an insertion or if it's a deletion, and if it's happening on purpose. Did somebody just maybe skip a couple lines as they were copying versus deliberately inserting something into the text? And like with the patristic fathers, sometimes it's a question, or the rabbinic sources, sometimes it's also a question of, was this person copying from, did this person bother to go to the shelf and pull out a physical book and look up the reference, or were they just working from memory? Um,
Well,
and
and if you're copying from hand, you're more likely to copy it in pieces
yeah,
and as quotations, because all of that text would have been difficult to do.
yes, exactly. And also, and it's also worth considering that whether we're talking about the first century Jewish community, or the early Christian community, these are people who, the literacy rate is extremely low, and all of this stuff is incredibly expensive. So just, for the community to try to invest resources in creating and preserving texts is a huge investment. And and they aren't necessary. And if you don't have a wealthy community, you don't necessarily have you want a book, right? And you're going to get the best book you can afford, and that might not be the prettiest or the cleanest or the most beautiful copy. And before we move on from that, I just want to say that that's something that I sometimes think about at Mass, because one of the things that happens when the gospel is read is the priest comes up, and either the priest or the deacon does the reading, and they hold the gospel book that they're reading from up in front of them as they're professing. And I always think, like in the Middle Ages, that would have been like, we have a book, right? Not just, we have the Bible and the Bible is great and we all love the Bible, but like, we have a book. our community like saved up all of this money and hired a scribe and have been maintaining a written object that might be the only book that like people might this might be the only book that people see on a regular basis, and we have one. Aren't we fancy?
Making me feel really rich with me and my pile of books.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And now we can all have books, and that's wonderful. Okay, so we've gotten way too off topic, but that's okay. Aldo, did you have anything else to say about Isaiah, or do we want to move on to Psalms?
I think I'm done with Isaiah, and the only thing I would say about the Psalms is that this is, just as a flourish. It was as a flourish. As far as I can see, I see not much
Yeah.
relationship with the rest of the readings, but perhaps the people who put up the lectionary would say otherwise.
Yeah. Okay, so do we want to just move straight on to Paul then? Okay. Yeah, I know, Amanda's favorite. Now, this piece of Paul is actually really interesting, one for contemporary reasons and one for historical reasons. The Catholic Church, as we all know, is currently arguing about whether or not to have women become deacons, and to figure out, if so, what does that look like? And this is, of course, really difficult because there's not a clear there's not a clear picture of what the female diaconate looked like in the past. But at the same time, they can't deny that the female diaconate existed at all. And part of the reason for that is because it says right here, for it has been reported to me about you, my brothers and sisters, by Chloe's people, that there are rivalries among you. So we have this reference to Chloe and a group of Christians who are being identified by their relationship to Chloe, which is and of course there are clearer examples elsewhere in the New Testament and in the book of Acts of women who evidently have some position in the early church and in the early Christian communities of influence and authority, one of whom is named Chloe. And we've got this little reminder of that the what in Catholic parlance is usually called clericalism, which is basically just the idea that the ordained male clergy are the ultimate seat of power and authority in the Catholic Church, and that's the way it's supposed to be because Jesus said so, is being undercut by references to people like Chloe. And so this piece of Corinthians being in the lectionary is kind of reminding people that there's a little bit of space for women in the church that isn't necessarily reflected today. The other thing that is really interesting about this from a historical perspective is that we've been talking about Corinthians as being like something that's authentically from Paul. And this particular section of Corinthians, which is just kind of an extended plea for unity in the Christian community, is one part that may or may not actually be by Paul. And the reason why there is a debate over that is because there is a early 2nd century heretic named Marcion. And Marcion was actually the first person to try to create a distinct Christian canon. And Marcion basically had none of the New Testament, a version of Luke that is considerably shorter than the version of Luke that is currently in our Bibles. And he also had 8 letters of Paul, which are, or rather versions of 8 letters of Paul. Which are coincidentally all the ones that are generally accepted as authentic Pauline letters. But those also are missing some of the material, including this kind of plea for unity. And currently there's a debate that's going on between patristic scholars, so people who study the early church fathers, about where Marcion fits in kind of the composition history of First Corinthians, of the New Testament canon as a whole, because the church father Tertullian, and one of these days I really would like to sit down and just read kind of some of the funniest parts of Tertullian's book about heretics, because Tertullian goes hard. I mean, Tertullian freaking hates Marcion, like just loathes him, right? But Tertullian, like, bless his nerdy little heart, puts in like giant block quotes from Marcion to the point that you can actually largely reconstruct Marcion, a lot of Marcion's books, just by pulling out all of the block quotes from Tertullian. Which, you know, like, I have to respect that level of petty. Like that is a level of petty that I can get behind. And Tertullian's argument was basically that Marcion was this arch heretic who had gone through and done the Thomas Jefferson thing and cut out all of the parts that he didn't like and called whatever was left Luke. And for a very, very long time, people just kind of believed Tertullian. In the last maybe 10 to 15 years, people have started wondering if what was actually going on was that the Christian community that Marcion was part of, because Marcion was kind of a 2nd generation Christian, that Marcion they may have been using a version of Luke that was originally created for their community, and that the author of Luke or someone else who was close to him basically created different versions of Luke for different Christian communities, or that the other parts of Luke and the additional parts of Paul are later additions that were put in by different communities of Christians. And I don't have a position on this because, quite frankly, there are a lot of very fine scholars who do not agree on this and are spilling a lot of ink on the topic. Again, we're just kind of waiting for that beautiful day where we find the, autographed copy of Luke that includes his works cited page at the end. But until that happens, we just have to go with what we've got. But the point is that whether you take the position that the plea for unity in 1 Corinthians was inserted later or that it was cut out, the point is that it's doing the same, regardless, it's doing the same thing in the text, which is kind of looking at this moment where Jesus has died. You've got, all kinds of missionaries, many of whom are very new converts, like the Apollos who's referred to, because in Acts, Apollos shows up. And in Acts, Apollos is described as someone who had received the baptism of John, but who had not been baptized into Christianity, but was running around preaching a whole bunch of stuff that Paul thought was incorrect. So that's clear. So clearly we've got this moment in Christian history where Jesus is dead. You've got all of these converts who are, the followers of Jesus, and people immediately converted by those converts are running around the Mediterranean world trying to spread the good news as much as they can, and nobody's preaching a consistent message. Do you have to convert to Judaism or not? Who knows? Should we be reading the New Testament, or should we be reading the Old Testament or not? Who knows? Should we be following the law or not? You got me. And and that's kind of reflected in also this reference to Paul, and then Cephas, of course, is the Cephas is the Greek form of the nickname Peter, which is Petrus in Latin. And I have no idea what that would be in Aramaic.
No, actually, Petros is Greek.
Oh, that's right. Petros is Greek.
Cephas is Aramaic, is Kepha in Aramaic.
Okay. Cephas is Aramaic. Thank you. I see. This is why we need Aldo around, because otherwise I get screwed up on remembering which language I don't speak is which. But anyway, but the point is that that's a reference to Peter, who, at least as the argument has come down to us through the sources we have available, at an early date thought that Christians should follow at least some of the Jewish laws, and who for sure felt that people who were already Jews were required to follow Jewish law, which may or may not have been Paul's position. But Paul certainly didn't think that Gentile converts were required to follow Jewish law, particularly related to diet and circumcision, which in the first century was kind of the big deal. And then the other thing that I did want to throw in before we close up, or rather before I shut up, about this particular piece of Paul, is that as far as people can figure out, the line in here, "Was Paul crucified for you?" is the reason why there is a tradition that when Paul was martyred, he wasn't crucified. Because just very briefly, for anyone who was raised in a tradition that doesn't get really, really obsessive about hagiographies, the tradition is that Peter and Paul went to Rome together. In the year and that they went to Rome together, and that they ended up being arrested and were executed at the same time. And that Peter was famously crucified. And of course, famously and requested to be crucified upside down, because he wasn't worthy to be crucified the same way Jesus was crucified. Which, by the way, is why a lot of Catholics, when they see like Satanists, or well, not really Satanists, but just like edgy teenagers, like trying to shock people by having an upside down cross, how horrible, just kind of laugh and go, guys, that's a cross of Saint Peter. You're not being offensive, you're just being kind of silly, because it's a cross of Saint Peter. It just is. We don't use it as much, but that's what it is. Peter, by the way, is usually represented by two crossed keys in iconography, because he was the first pope, so he gets the crossed keys. And then, of course, St. Paul, who was famously a Roman citizen, asks to be beheaded, because that was what happened, because Roman citizens were saved from being crucified, which was a extraordinarily painful and humiliating death. And so historically, there is some reason to think that the Apostle Paul could have requested to be decapitated, but one of the reasons that people will also bring up for, oh yeah, this is how we know that Paul was martyred, is because, well, it says in Corinthians that, Paul was not crucified for you. So clearly, Paul knew it was coming. Paul knew that he wasn't going to be crucified.
Mm. 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 I think that's reading it a little too much.
Yeah, maybe. Maybe.
And also, that is actually the ones that is the one hagiography we did hear about in church. So yeah, which is why it always confused me that people would say that Peter had been crucified upside down. I was like, where is this? Okay. Anyway, my observation though, and I have to say this is always what comforts me about the New Testament, is what is wrong with the church now has always been wrong with the church. And that's, we're not messing up too bad. We're just perpetuating the past. Considering the current political climate in the US, we have lots of Christians on one side and lots of Christians on the other side of a lot of issues. And as tempting as it would be to say, not Christians, they're not real, as much as I'd really like to. It's not really a stance we can take.
Well, and I think that, I agree. The temptation is always to kind of do the, no true Scotsman thing. They can't be Christian because they're doing these horrible things, and Christians don't do horrible things.
Yeah.
And I think that rather than just trying to kick people out and I have to say, getting to call somebody a heretic feels really good. Right? Just telling people, shut up, you're a heretic. Like busting out the catechism and saying that's interesting because I love that. I love that. But at the same time, I agree with you that we can't tell people to just like, you're not Christian, so we don't have to listen to you. I feel like we have to do something even harder, which is look at people and say, my brother in Christ, what is your problem? Like, have you not been reading? Have you not been listening? Were you asleep? Like, and I think the answer is, that a lot of the same people who, misinterpret the Gospels are the same people who, insist that Kylo Ren is some kind of tragic hero in Star Wars, as opposed to, being this obnoxious little incel who deserve to get stabbed with a lightsaber, frankly. Oh, okay. Okay.
I have gotten in exactly one internet conversation about that, and it didn't end well. So I'm going to keep my mouth shut.
Yes,
on Kylo Ren.
I think that we should stop before we get flamed into oblivion by all of the Reylo fans. And if you don't know what Reylo is, I'm not going to tell you unless specifically asked, because you don't want
Lucky you.
Just enjoy your ignorance. Anyway, so that's kind of was there anything else we wanted to say about Paul?
Well, I would like to, speculate a little on the nature of each and every one of the groups which are mentioned in Corinthians.
Go for it.
So it seems that Paul was let's start with Apollos and Paul. So it seems that Apollos came from Alexandria, and he was more of a philosophical nature. And I'm basing this on a video by Dr. David Lidwell. He proposes that Apollos was a very philosophically oriented preacher or teacher, and that made Paul jealous. And I even remember there's in one of the letters where Paul says that perhaps he's not as eloquent as Apollos, but he has some other characteristics. And then we could just move on to Cephas, who some scholars tend to think that it is not the same person as Peter, but at the same time, just the fact that he's called by an Aramaic nickname, it tells us that he may be a Judaizing, or closer to the Jewish tradition in early Christianity. And then the ones who are from Christ, perhaps those were people who thought they didn't need either Paul, Apollos, or Cephas. And I even tend to think, of course, this is just speculation, but I cannot help but think of them as some kind of Gnostics. People who didn't need, who perhaps received some kind of revelation from Jesus instead of just trying to follow the Jewish law, or you're just trying um, to have faith in Christ. But of course, that's just me.
Are you talking about Cephas's followers or
No, the ones who follow Christ. That so what I was thinking, I know this is not from scholarship, but it has always struck me that they sound a bit like the later Gnostics, who may be just relying on a revelation directly from Christ, and they do not need any other human agent to preach the gospel to them.
Yeah. On the other hand, I think that I think that you're really onto something there, just based on my own reading. Although I do think that with Gnosticism, kind of the big debate, even before the Nag Hammadi library was found, and certainly after, is how much is Gnosticism a Greek movement that, kind of picks up Christian ideas. So it's like you have Gnosticism, and then you have like Christian Gnosticism, and even potentially different, more sort of just Greek philosophical Gnosticism. And now there's kind of a newer generation of scholars that are kind of going back and looking at Gnosticism as a distinctly Christian movement, as being kind of like, what we were talking about, Apollos being from Alexandria. Alexandria, of course, in the first century is sort of the second city of the Jewish intellect, or maybe the third city of the Jewish intellectual world, where like Alexandria is where you have this, sort of very Greek influenced, very educated, very urbanized Jewish community. Of course, probably the most famous person to come out of there is Philo of Alexandria,
Mhm.
who significantly is read by Christians, and not Jews. And kind of talking about how like early Christianity, when they pick up Jews, pick up these like educated Greek speaking Jews who already are going to have, and it makes sense to me, obviously they're already going to have all of these Greek philosophical ideas. So when they become Christian, they're going to keep doing all the stuff that they were doing before, plus Jesus. So I think your idea makes a lot of sense.
And it has a lot of holes because, as you know, the term Gnosticism isn't really.
Oh yeah. Well, and it's only been since the 50s that we've actually had enough of these, Gnostic texts and enough of the books that didn't make it into the Bible to really start to say, okay, this is what the movement looks like. At the same time, it's definitely the case that, there was a time and a place where there were, where nobody had figured out what Orthodox Christianity was even going to be, right? So it's like now we kind of have things like the Nicene Creed, right? Or even just the fact that, all Christian groups read, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in some form. that there's, that kind of thing where if somebody were to say found a new church and say, we're going to read the Nag Hammadi library, right? That's our Bible. Well, most Christians would say you're not Christian anymore, right? You're something else, or you're this kind of weird exotic Christianity that isn't. Is it really? Like, really? Is it really? No. But at that point, they didn't even have like that kind of a yardstick. It was just like, who's the best preacher? Who is, who has the, the most authoritative connection to Jesus. And everything is totally up for grabs. Now, you were saying something really interesting earlier, Aldo, about there being debate over whether the guy who's name checked here is actually is Peter Cephas. So
Right.
could you talk about that a little bit more? Because that was a new one for me.
Well, I have heard the comment. I haven't heard the arguments, but it seems that for some scholars, the fact that there is some Cephas mentioned in the New Testament literature, it doesn't automatically translate into identifying him with the Peter of the Peter where Jesus calls Peter the rock upon which he will establish his new church.
Okay. Which actually makes sense because, Peter is a nickname, and you can kind of see how, in the, second and third generation of Christianity, people might be inclined to use the names of apostles on their kids. Right.
Right.
And I know, like, for example, Baden's recent reconstruction of Marcion's gospel, he actually proposes that Luke was a sort of a child of like that early second generation, who was named Luke after Paul's traveling companion, and who was writing maybe in like the 100 110, and that people later on just were like, oh, it was written, there was an oral tradition, oh, it was written by Luke. Well, which Luke? Well, how many Lukes have you heard of, right? And and certainly that's something that like, I don't know about you guys, I still have to like use an index or Google constantly when I'm reading about the Herods. Because like trying to sort out Herod the Great from Herod Antipas to Herod, isn't there like a third Herod?
Yeah, there's Archelaus, and
there's Herod Archelaus.
another.
Yeah, and then there's Herodias. And like all the women are named like either Mariame or Salome. And like I could see myself, if I had to like write a description of the Herodian dynasty from memory, so I can easily imagine somebody assuming that it was the famous Luke wrote Luke, as opposed to Luke some guy.
Okay, so just quick, there's Herod the Great, who was the father. Then there was Herod Archelaus and Herod Antipas, who were sons of Herod the Great.
So they're brothers, both named Herod.
Brothers. Sorry, and Herod Philip the first.
Okay, and these are all brothers.
These are all brothers.
We just have the Herod as their first name.
And then you have the grandson, Herod Agrippa the first, and then the great grandson, Herod Agrippa the second. So
Yeah.
they weren't, that original when naming
Yeah.
their children.
Yeah.
Like the Plantagenets. They weren't very original either.
Yeah, exactly. It's like everybody's named, either John or
Henry or
Edward.
Edward.
Yeah.
You're like, oh, there's a Richard. Yay!
And then you get to your third Richard and you're like, I'm confused again. or it's like, we're reading about Spanish history and like everybody's Catalina. It's like they're all named either Catalina or Isabella.
And everybody's got a Maria in there.
Yeah. And well, sometimes a Juana, but
Yeah.
anyway. But yeah, but the point is when you have like the same three names circulating throughout time, it's no wonder that people get confused. Anyway, so have we exhausted Paul for now?
I think we did. I think we
Okay.
can move to the gospel.
Okay, so let's move on to the gospel. Oops. That was my alarm going off telling us it's been an hour and a half. So we're right on track when we have the gospels. Okay. I just have one really frivolous point before I get going is I just really want to take a moment to appreciate the calling of Simon and the calling of Andrew. Just how beautifully cinematic this is, right? You've got like Jesus is walking along the shoreline. He sees these two guys. He's like, "Hey, come with me." And they're like, "Okay, let's go. Let's do this thing." I mean, it's like it's the beginning of every heist movie ever, right? Where it's like, okay, we're gonna do the thing. What am I gonna do? I've got to go around and get my crew together, right? And I sometimes wonder, and like I sometimes think that, like, is that where this trope comes from, in kind of, modern literature, is like, what was this kind of in the back of somebody's head as they're writing the Blues Brothers, and they're like, okay, what do you got to do first? You got to get your crew together, right? Because that's what it's like, what are we gonna do? We're gonna destroy the Roman Empire, but not how you think. Who's with me?
I mean, if you're just going by what's in the text, they didn't even ask what they were doing. They were just like, sure, sounds good.
He's just like, yo, come with me.
She's very teenage boy coded of them, by the way.
Yeah, oh yeah, exactly. And I just have to say, like, people often make a lot about like referring to God exclusively using male pronouns, and should we use they or just say God, and that kind of stuff. And I certainly can feel that in relation to the Holy Spirit and in relation to God the Father. I have zero problem thinking about referring to Jesus exclusively using masculine pronouns, because like this is such a guy thing, right? Like it's such a guy thing to just like, you walk up to a couple of guys, and you're like, hey, you want to go do the thing? And they're like, sure, let's go do that. And then, and then, next thing you know, you're running around Galilee and, getting into all kinds of shenanigans, right? I mean,
it's very boy coded.
Yeah, exactly. It's like this is the most like
The best kind of boy-coded. Don't get me
yeah,
wrong.
yeah, yeah. No. I mean, like like in a good way, right? It's like it's not negative masculine behavior, but it's very masculine behavior, right? Like as a woman, you're reading this and you're like, yeah, that tracks.
Could never.
Yeah,
Wouldn't be me.
tracks.
I'd at least need to take snacks with me.
Yes, exactly. Yes, exactly. If Jesus had called 12 women the feeding of the 5,000, the feeding of the 5,000 would not have required a miracle because they would have just been like, okay, let me check in my basket. And like pretty soon everybody would have eaten.
Or it would have been a much less impressive miracle.
Yeah, exactly. It would have been like, okay, we have to make like 500 fish stretch. Okay, anyway, so now that we're done being, displaying benign sexism, um, I have a exciting announcement. Early on, I had mentioned that one of the things I've been consulting is this book called The Five Gospels, translated with a translation and commentary by Robert Funk and the Jesus Seminar. The Jesus Seminar was a big project in the 80s and 90s where kind of some of the leading lights of historical Jesus scholarship of that era got together and just kind of voted on, do we think that Jesus actually said this? And then they came up with a new gospel translation. They included the Gospel of Thomas, which is a sayings gospel that includes a lot of material that's in Matthew and Luke, but also has some sayings that are not in Matthew and Luke. And one of the things they do is they conveniently color code things where it becomes lighter colored, the more likely it is that they think Jesus saw it. And the Jesus Seminar, unlike a lot of modern scholars, did not believe that Jesus had a historical connection with John the Baptist, which is something that now this consensus is starting to move towards there being some kind of historical connection with John the Baptist. And also the Jesus Seminar were very much in the Jesus was not an apocalyptic preacher era. That's another thing that has kind of, the pendulum has started swinging back recently. So this is a long story short. So far, everything that we've been talking about is stuff that the Jesus Seminar didn't think had anything to do with the historical Jesus. But today, it's different because they think that the phrase become my followers and I'll have you fishing for people, or more poetically, I will make you fishers of men, because it shows up in Mark and in Matthew and is the kind of, very working class, everyday sort of language and metaphors that Jesus seems to have used. They think that might be something that Jesus might have said. So if you are kind of keeping track of the most the most restrictive scholarly reading possible, this reading from critical scholars, this reading we have a maybe Jesus said it. So that is so that is a banner for the channel. We have
Maybe
our
Jesus said it.
yeah, we have our first instance of something that there is extremely widespread consensus Jesus actually said in something like those words, which is pretty cool. Otherwise, again, I think we talked enough about how, this section of the gospel is really just kind of there as a narrative piece. It's there to tell the story of, this is how Jesus's ministry started. This is what it looked like, and making a point that he isn't, looking for followers among the great or among the educated. He's just picking up, people who believe in him and people who are willing to, listen to what he has to say. As Jesus is kind of striking out on his own in the aftermath of John the Baptist getting arrested and executed by Herod. And although, just to refresh everyone, could you kind of run through what we know about the arrest of John the Baptist? Because I don't think we've talked about that in great detail, and your Herods.
Well, no, I actually looked at them. So what we know is that let's start with the Herods. So the Herods were a dynasty, a puppet dynasty for the Romans. So the Jewish population didn't like them. They converted to Judaism. They were Idumeans or Edomites, or they were Arabs. So that was against the Jewish tradition. So there was some pushback from the Jewish population. Aside from that, Herod wasn't the kindest or the nicest person in existence. And one of his sons, I can't remember the relationship, but I think they were marrying. So this Herod Archelaus, I think, was the one who was marrying one of his sister, or
it was his sister-in-law.
his sister-in-law.
He had his brother. Eventually made his brother divorce his wife. The brother eventually gets executed, and Herod marries. That was Herodias, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then Herod marries Herodias, who is, of course, his brother's wife, which, according to Jewish law, is a big giant no-no.
Mm-hmm.
Except, of course, under the instance where a levirate marriage is required because the brother died childless. But this was not the case there, because Herodias also already had sons with her husband, who end up kind of getting executed. Or at least I believe she had sons. I know there was at least one daughter.
Correct.
Well, either way, if it was a divorce, it's still not levirate marriage.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's the point. Well, yeah, like I say, eventually the brother dies because Herod kills him. I mean, just to sort of summarize what a bad guy Herod was, well, other than the whole, murdering your brother so you can marry his wife thing. Herod allegedly, as he was dying, was like, round up a person from every household and kill them so that somebody will be sad when I'm dead.
That's a choice.
Yeah, I mean, I should mention that this is like an apocryphal story that's probably about as real as Marie Antoinette saying, let them eat cake. But it also kind of tells you a lot about Herod, that when people were trying to sum up how bad was Herod,
This was the story they told.
this was the story they told, and everybody was like, yeah, that's Herod. That sounds like something that Herod would do. Um, you know, of course now, we don't round up firstborn children. We just, discourage their parents from getting them measles vaccines so they die of preventable illnesses. But anyway, so people say, why still read the Bible? I don't know. Why is the Bible still relevant?
People still be people, and that's why.
Yeah, exactly. People are still people. At a certain point, it's like, how much more do you need to say about the way that people can be people? You're just kind of repeating yourself with a different cast of characters. But anyway, so I think that is kind of all that's kind of all I have about this gospel. Did anybody else have thoughts that they want to get out?
No, not really. I think most of this passage is just, like a transition to Jesus's actual ministry.
Mm-hmm. Yes, very much so. And just and we'll really see this next Sunday on February 4th, which is going to be Matthew 5, 1 through 12, which of course is the Beatitudes as they show up in Matthew. So this is just kind of, like Aldo said, just a transition. But it also, of course, gets Peter in there really early, which for Catholics, you always have to give some love to the first pope.
Mhm. Yeah, Jesus is gathering the JC bunch.
Exactly. Like he's getting his group together, and
He's getting the OG crew.
yeah, exactly. He's getting the
Together.
OG crew, and who is his right hand man from the word go? Peter. And who's the successor of Peter? That's right, Leo the 14th. Okay. And to be fair, yes, until you get to like maybe the 3rd century, the the Bishop of Rome isn't really that important, but there was a bishop in Rome continuously. Okay. And obviously he had to be ordained by somebody. So there's kind of a line. So there is like a real, like, this guy was ordained by this guy who was ordained this guy, and this guy was elected Bishop of Rome, and then they elected this guy, and so on and so forth. And that really does, like, what I'm saying is, you can play like 175 degrees of separation and start out with Pope Leo and end up with Peter. And that's all I'm saying.
This is giving a lot of like martial arts or tea service lineage, where
Yes, exactly. That is exactly what it is. I mean, because that's how well, I mean, like, that's even how today, how like modern academics, you have these academic lineages of, I studied with this person who studied with this person who studied with that person.
I mean, that is literally how the like various martial arts schools or the T schools work.
Yeah, exactly.
Is, this is your master, and their master was this master, and
yeah. I mean, it's a pretty common human way of kind of establishing, of establishing authority, right? Because you can say, okay, we're operating, in this continuous tradition. We're part of a chain.
So you said heist movie earlier. Now I'm thinking I'm getting Jesus the C drama, and it is the Wuxia C drama, and it's great. Okay. I'm having a good time.
Yeah. So we've got so we have Peter, who is the first called, the rock upon whom the church will be built, with a little bit of help from a lot of people. So that, I think, is where we can kind of leave it for today. Now it is time for our parish announcements, because, this is Nerd Church. We hope to be joined again, sort of periodically, by Kip Davis and possibly some other scholars that we are working on reaching out to. Hopefully on Monday or Tuesday, I will have an edited video up that will be laying the groundwork for a live response video that we will be doing on Thursday, where we will be, in the live response video, we will be watching and responding directly to the very weird and very sad, but unfortunately we need to talk about it because this is our lives now, ceremony in which Tom Homan was given an award by a organization called Catholics for Catholics. And again, we're not going to play the No True Scotsman game. What we are going to do is tell them that they're being a bad Catholic and a bad Christian and probably a bad human being, and need to think about their life and think about their choices, and go to Mass, and probably pray an after reparation to the Virgin of Guadalupe while they're doing that. Because do you want to be the man who has to tell the Blessed Virgin Mary why he used Our Lady of Guadalupe to say that it was okay to justify putting Mexican children in cages? Do you want to have that conversation, John Yep? Because I don't want you to have that conversation. So, that live stream will be happening on Thursday, a video that will give you the context that you would need to understand the live stream is coming up on hopefully Tuesday of next week, maybe Monday, if I can figure out video editing or find someone who can. And then sometime in the next couple of weeks, I will be interviewing in person. Everyone else will be virtual, having a conversation with Dr. Shelley Rubinovich, who is a Canadian scholar whose PhD was on nichitos, which are little household shrines that people will put up in their yard or in some other significant place to them. She did a comparative study of what that looked like among Mexican American Catholics in Tucson, in French Canadian Catholics in Quebec, and Italian American Catholics somewhere in the Northeast that I don't remember right now. But we will be having that conversation and sharing that with all of you in a couple of weeks. So That's all that we have for now. Does anyone have anything that we would like to add?
I
Okay.
think that's it.
Okay, so in that case, we will end the live stream. And we hope to